Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people and economic production units. This is Chris Coppola. Welcome you back to the Fork in Time podcast. And I am joined by an esteemed group, one of whom's already flipped me off, one of whom probably wanted to. Oh, I got a double. Let's start with the one who only flipped me off once. Dylan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone.
And Evan.
Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Evan. I had to find a way to one-up Dylan. Also, technically, Chris, you did not say economic theory. You said economic production units, so I will technically be the first one to provide the economic theory for this podcast.
Okay. Until I put it behind a paywall, and then it. Yeah.
Dang it.
There's an advantage to being the guy that does post-production on these. Today,
He who controls the post-production controls the future.
Given kids, we're seizing the means of post-production.
We're seizing the memes of post-production.
I'm gonna get it back on track. I promise I'm gonna try. So we are gonna keep going down the different fork we developed for a change in the Republican National Convention in 1860. Basically, Lincoln is not selected there. We wind up with William Seward being elected. And I think kind of the first episode of this arc focused on the convention, focused on getting William Seward basically president. If anything, that makes what everybody knows about the election of 1860 even more what everybody knows about the election of 1860, which is triggering the Civil War. So, Dylan, do you want to take over and kind of get from Seward becoming president to where we are right now?
Yeah, so just a quick recap of kind of the second episode. That mostly dealt with the situation of the war. And one of the interesting things about Seward winning is that kind of delayed the onset of outright hostilities for a critical period of maybe 4, 5, 6 months, because Seward had this belief that, also, if you can hear my dog, sorry. Seward had this belief that if he just waited it out, cooler heads in the South would prevail over the secessionists and they would come back. And what that does is that pushes outright hostilities into the fall of 1861. That brings the outright hostilities starting around the time of the Wheeling Convention, which is what separated in our timeline West Virginia from Virginia. So in this new timeline, the result is that because the hostilities start out at around the same time as the Wheeling Convention, you actually have secession from the secessionists happening in West Virginia, and then later in the war in kind of eastern Tennessee, in the Appalachians, in Franklin, which is the original name for kind of the eastern Tennessee, Knoxville, Chattanooga kind of area of the state. Those become Union territories. What this does for the war is this creates, in effect, a dagger into the heart of Confederate territory that initially is not exploited because obviously it's very rough territory. There's not necessarily a ton of people or logistical capability there to move things in and out. But over time, what that does is that allows the Union, once the war kind of develops, to reach kind of the area of Sherman's March to the Sea quicker. So it essentially makes a more vulnerable Confederacy because now they have a much longer border they have to try and maintain, and it allows Union attacks from an initial start point that is much deeper into what we understand as kind of the heart of Confederate territory. The result of that is that in our timeline, the fall of Atlanta was in September of 1864. The war was not yet won. And during the election of 64, the war was very much still a debate over, okay, Do we keep fighting? Do we not? In this timeline, Atlanta and Chattanooga fall much earlier. We're talking even in 1863, not 1864. So in an 1864 election, which is where we're starting off this episode in this timeline, the war is already, if not completely won, it is in the last weeks where the Confederates are just all depressed and everybody knows the writing on the wall. The other thing that is a big differentiator, and we talked about this in both episodes, is this is much more a war that from the outset is about the abolition of slavery. It is a much more moral position for the Union to occupy. That is going to come up later in this episode once we get to the aftermath of the war. But for right now, we are basically coming into 1864 election season with the war, if not won, all but the writing's on the wall. Everybody can see that the Union is going to win. So the election is much less about, are we going to win the war or not? It's, okay, how do we deal with the country now that the war has basically been won? And that's kind of where we find ourselves. And to start out, this is election season after all. We've got to figure out who's on the ballot in 1864, the presidential election. Gentlemen, obviously one person, William Seward, is going to be on the ballot. He's not going to just quit after having beaten the crap out of the South. He's going to take advantage of it. But who else is showing up in ballot boxes in the 1864 election?
So I do want to kind of talk about our election of 1864, just to kind of give a little bit of a reference.
Yeah.
That was basically George McClellan, who was also a big character in the only video episode we've ever done. Please go look that up. I spent so much of my life on it. But basically,
let's be real. He was famous for parking his butt and not doing anything. Yep. And just training his soldiers, and ended up getting fired by Lincoln because he didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partly why he ended up running against him in the presidential election. He's just like, I'm kind of mad, Lincoln, that you let me go. Mm-hmm. And I think we should have a different approach towards the South, which involves more sitting on my butt.
At a negotiating table.
Right.
That's very
in this case, comfortably sitting on his butt.
Comfortably sitting on his butt, exactly.
And he basically was like, you know what? It's not worth it. But that kind of nomination, that kind of run is in looking at what just happened in our timeline in 1863, where you're looking at, Gettysburg and all of these massive casualty battles. And there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not very bright. And it's a viable political statement to say, maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe we need to negotiate with them. In this alternate timeline we created, the war's over. It is won. And so you're in a situation where nobody in the North could say, as a realistic political platform, we should negotiate with the Confederacy. We've won. The issue now is Reconstruction. That is the issue we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and so I think... Sorry, go ahead, Dylan.
No, go ahead, Evan.
Well, what I was just going to say is that I think this presents a very tantalizing possibility of... Because, in our timeline, the Democratic Party and Democratic stance, well, let's be real, like 80% of them, if not 90% of them, were not even involved in that election because they were sequestered in the South, during the Civil War on the other side. And so but you still have a decent bit of, I think they're called like Copperhead Democrats or whatever, a contingent that still remains like in the northern states, in the Union states. And they're basically the ones like McClellan who are arguing for a negotiated settlement. I think in this timeline, with how much the moral righteous cause the war from almost the initial get-go has become, there is going to be very little room for that sort of like copperhead Democrat contingent, as Chris mentioned, any real political position to negotiate with the South is just not going to exist, because the war is essentially all but over. So what I think the tantalizing possibility is this: do the Democrats even bother running anybody this year? With the South basically almost completely defeated, no real viable national party plank platform for them to like rally around or coalesce around. Because who's going to argue that, like, William Seward did a bad job of winning the war, or we should allow slavery again, or I don't know, any other kind of, sort of crackpot policy position that an opposing party is just going to take. The possibility to me is we might see, if not the outright cessation of the Democratic Party as a viable movement, I think there's a possibility that there's going to be a new party that rises up to challenge Seward from a different point of view, and it's not coming from the Democratic side. What do you gentlemen think about that?
Yeah, I think I can certainly see the Democrats, throwing in somebody who amounts to a write-in candidate, one of the last crazy crackpots who doesn't realize the old age is gone. But I think because the question is much more about Reconstruction, I think what it's going to come down to is your camp of pro-Seward abolitionist Republicans, your Thaddeus Stevens types, your Seward types, who are they are both the military and the moral victors. So what they say goes. They don't have any interest in particularly moderating their opinion. They're just going to enforce abolition on their terms on the South as a defeated, occupied, not foreign nation, but basically pariah chunk of the country.
I mean, they're vanquished foes.
Yeah.
Lincoln sees them as errant brothers.
Yeah.
Seward sees them as vanquished foes.
Yeah. And I think especially in, kind of your Western states and some of your, I'm going to say more recent Republicans in terms of, because in the 1850s, there are a lot of Democrats who leave the Democratic Party, go to the Free Soilers, to the Know Nothings. Basically, a lot of what in 1864-65 we would consider the moderate wing of the Republican Party or the conservative wing of the Republican Party are basically going to be liberal Democrats in a pre-Civil War timeline. So if you think of Seward and your Thaddeus Stevenses and your sort of New England hardcore abolitionists on one side, the other side of that argument or that debate is going to be, okay, what is that position, what is it going to cost us when we reunite the country? And so I think the counterpole to Seward is going to be not a Democrat position per se, but it is going to be the important thing is bringing the Union back together, not enforcing a new position on a defeated foe. It is a reunification, not a occupation. And so I think that's where guys like Lincoln are going to be very interesting, because he is still, even through most of his presidency, even though he recognized the moral rightness of abolition, from a legalistic perspective, at the end of the day, his primary goal was the reintegration of the Union, and everything else, if he could achieve the moral victory too, that was great. But if he couldn't achieve it in the unification of the Union, it could always be fought another day. So I think your guys like Lincoln and some of your more, quote unquote, conservative Republicans and your former Democrat Republicans are, especially in the Western states and what's left of kind of the border state regions outside of New England, are going to start naturally banding together and say, the important thing is the war's over. The country needs to get back together. And now that we've established that it is one country, you don't get to leave, then the issue of slavery in new territories, slavery in the former Confederacy, we can figure out what that looks like.
Yeah. And I think that's a very natural opening for a possible leader like Lincoln to come about and run on an opposing ticket, actually, versus Seward. And this, the concerns of these more border Western states. And again, also considering the fact that we gave a couple of the border states to the south in this alternate timeline as well. Be that as it may, I think, Dylan, you present an excellent point that the defining characteristic of this election is not, is the war going to be won? Are we going to negotiate? It's going to be, how do we settle this? How do we handle this mess? And I think it was Chris. I think you had a very interesting pick for who might actually be leading the charge on the opposition side. And before I hand it over to you to talk about that, I will say Lincoln has none of the notoriety that he has in our timeline. He is still a long ago distant, two-term congressman from Illinois who was broadly supportive in this alternate timeline. He'd be broadly supportive of the war effort, probably still trying to find his way to climb up the Republican Party ranks, and sees in 1864 his moment to be able to possibly break through. That's a much different Lincoln than the one that we remember in our timeline as being, he's, basically memorialized and glorified as a moralistic crusader for abolition and the rights of slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, remove the fact that really he was much more of a pragmatist and did the Emancipation Proclamation for wartime strategic reasons as opposed to his own personal beliefs. Let's be honest. Pretty much everybody was racist back in that time period of American history. Lincoln was no exception. Much probably less of one, much more of a gentler one than, antebellum Southern slave owners. But he still, let's just put it this way, he did not view the plights of African American slaves because he had any great deep affinity for them. I'll just put it that way. So, Chris, who do we see as possibly leading this? I think we, ironically kind of called it something in our timeline, or maybe we called Seward's ticket the national unity ticket, because that's what Abraham Lincoln was in our timeline with Lincoln and Johnson. So, Chris, do we see Lincoln running? I don't know, would it be a Republican Party, a national unity party, or do we see someone else leading the charge?
So I think we mentioned the name John Fremont.
Yes.
Who was kind of he was a war hero from previous. He kind of is the guy that got us California in the Mexican-American War.
Gotta beat my chest because I'm a Californian. He's my guy.
Naturally known. And he also ran for president previously as
in 56, I think.
He was the first Republican nominee.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
So 52.
Okay. He also was very prominent in the Free Soil.
Mm-hmm.
He's the person that got national recognition. The one thing I think is political parties like to survive. They don't like to go the way of the Whigs. I think in the United States, going into this, you did have Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy. To this day, you still have many places that will, Democratic parties that will hold Jefferson Jackson dinners. So I think this group we're talking about, these soft reconstructionists, I think, keep the Democratic name because there's nobody else that has it. So they kind of show up and keep the name. And also, it will make it easier for us to discuss that. So John C. Fremont is a Democrat, runs as a Democrat. And like we talked about, Lincoln was kind of disappointed about missing out at the convention in 1860. By the way, keep in mind, nobody who is a Republican at this point in national political life necessarily is married to a party title.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Republicans have not existed for that long.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we kind of discussed that it would be a Fremont, and he selects Lincoln as his vice president to kind of outreach and try and bring some of these disaffected Republicans back to, or over to their party, I guess.
Yeah, and I could see that. By the way, I just fact-checked really quick. Fremont and the Republicans first ran in 56. Fremont was still doing adventurism stuff post Mexican-American War in 52. Just getting the time frame right there. But Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And just seeing a kind of, turning on its head completely of like our understanding of, party realignment and who is claiming what mantle or what side. I think it's just really interesting because, like I made reference to, with a moral crusade version of the Civil War, a much harsher possible, Reconstruction policy on the part of the Seward ticket. The Democrats basically just being, as you mentioned, Chris, almost an empty shell, really, just completely open for any sort of opposition candidate to walk into, even if that opposition candidate is still basically just a flavor of Republicans. I mean, this is kind of reminding me of, the Republicans who ran against FDR. It's basically like, yeah, FDR was so successful in trouncing them that the Republican Party basically just became, we can do what you're doing, but better. So I feel like that's the kind of the flavor that we get in this election is the opposition Democrats end up really just becoming, we're Republicans, but we're better Republicans. So we're just going to yank that name because that's the only way we really have something to run under.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So with that all set up in mind, and very different dynamics for this election, how do we see it playing out? Do we think that Lincoln ends up becoming vice president in this timeline under a Fremont administration, or do we see Seward still cruising to victory? And I spaced out for a second, gentlemen. Did we actually discuss who Seward is still running with?
Nope.
Let's tie up that loose end.
I was about to keep us honest and do that.
Yeah. So before we talk about that, let's figure out who Seward is running with, because, dear listeners, if you did listen to the previous episodes, you'll recall that we had Edward Bates as I think he was a congressman or senator from Illinois, or not Illinois, Missouri. Yeah.
And by the way, in this circumstance, since we were playing around with some of these border states, he may not be from the United States.
Yeah. He may in the same way that Johnson stayed in the Senate from Tennessee, but he will essentially have no constituency.
Right. Exactly.
And thus will bring no voting power. Yeah. Right.
So Bates, Lincoln, Yeats, Hannibal Hamlin in our timeline. I think, just from what we just said right there, I think it makes a lot of sense for Bates to get yeeted. And who do we see replacing him as the vice presidential nominee?
This is, the war's won, but maybe still going on. When you have elections in the middle of wars, generals become important. And one of the people we discussed, we thought about Grant. Well, we talked about Grant a little bit. The simple fact is that Grant is still an active general. And the other thing is, if you look at the history of Grant is kind of another Eisenhower, or reminds me a little bit of like Colin Powell in the 90s.
Yeah.
Or like, is he even registered? Is he Democrat? Is he Republican? Does he even vote?
Yeah, the Democrats tried to court Eisenhower too.
Yeah.
Like, he was very apolitical, but he was just like, rah, America, victory in Europe. So it's like, someone who's just very red-blooded American through and through, who's gonna court him. Yeah.
If you look at like what happened with the Grant election, that was very much like, yeah, sure, we'll just put him up there. Like he didn't really have that drive for it. Sherman, another general in our mind, literally came up with something called a Sherman Pledge. Which said, don't nominate me. I don't want it. I won't run if you do nominate me.
I won't run if you nominate. I will not serve if elected. Like, that's where we get the coined the term a Sherman-esque denunciation, or a Sherman-esque denial, is someone who refuses to run for office and will refuse to serve if elected.
And as political as American generals of the Civil War were, because there's a whole lot going on there, one of them actually had held elected office before the war, was a somewhat successful general, and went and held many elected offices after the war. That was Benjamin Butler. And one of the things about Butler, please go back and watch that video episode. Like a chunk of my soul went into going.
And also, please go back and listen to the Little Brothers Club, because Benjamin Butler, spoiler alert, ends up as someone very important in that timeline too.
But he was in command of Fort Monroe at the southern end of the Virginia Peninsula. And as the Peninsular Campaign is moving towards Richmond, commanded by McClellan, very slow moving, every time McClellan stopped and paused, they woke up the next morning and saw a ton of fortifications in front of them. And Butler put it together. Who's building these fortifications? It's not Johnson. It's not the Confederate general. He's the one ordering them to be built, but the manpower to actually build all of these defenses all the way up the peninsula are slaves held by Virginia.
The Confederates basically went creative mode in building their fortifications, or they're like in build mode in Fortnite.
And like Butler sat there and realized, hey, wait, they're using them. These people are being used by the Confederacy. And I can play an Uno reverse on them and bring them to our side, because they will come to us if I just make them an offer. And so he was one of the first people to actively try and recruit, may not be the right word, but to bring over runaway slaves, bring over African Americans, one who used them for the Union cause. And he wasn't necessarily yet able to arm them and convert them into all of these, 54 Massachusetts, all of those. But at least we can get them out of Confederate hands and stop them being used against us.
Yeah.
So,
and in an
And I mean, it's basically.
1864
Go ahead, Dylan.
Yeah, I'm just going to say in an 1864 election context, that gives Butler, especially for like a Seward super radical pro-abolitionist ticket, not only is he a military commander, but Seward can say, that just gives Seward an extra leg to stand on, because I'm the guy that won the war. I'm the guy that freed the slaves, but here's the man that came up with the idea for it and actually fought for it.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a very hard ticket to argue against for that camp.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is basically you have the reverse of if you build it, they will come. It's if you don't build it and you allow them to build it, they will come. But also, let's also not neglect the fact that there were actually some black regiments on both sides of the Civil War. I definitely much more so on the Union side, because there were some like forced ones on the Confederate side. But I do think that Butler in this timeline could just have a little bit more of that push or that emphasis on not just having them being, conscripted labor, but actually having some, more soldiers in his ranks.
I think the thing is, I don't think Lincoln was so focused on keeping the Union together, there were actually arguments against arming African Americans.
Yeah. I think Seward just tells Butler to go to town.
If that memo hit Seward's desk, it's signed.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, like there's no John Brown, there's no, or Fears, there's none of that. It's like, no, just do whatever you can to get them on our side, on our team.
So with a Fremont Lincoln running as a reconstituted Democratic Party and a Seward Butler running as a Republican Party, who do we think carries that 1864 kind of war's over? What do we do with them now election?
Yeah, I think so. Just to put it in the context of where the country is in terms of 1864, the war.
And by the way, you mean physically, geographically, not the sense of the American people.
Yeah. Not my highfalutin and flowery stuff I usually do.
Leave it to the lawyer.
From an electoral perspective, the country, in terms of what electoral college votes do we have to get to win the presidency, is basically entirely above the Mason-Dixon line. Probably at least 80% of which, if not more, is New England and the Atlantic coast states. So, I mean, in terms of
in
population,
Ohio are very important, but
well, yeah, they are. But in terms of population,
and also this podcast has no stance on whether New York is New England or not. We are not giving.
Basically, just the Eastern Seaboard in New England. That is so much of the electoral gravity in this election is up there that I think, as attractive as I think, the Fremont Lincoln ticket is going to be in some of the in some states and in some portions of states, especially as you get further out west. I think just the sheer gravity of the much, also much more radical Republican kind of electorate of New England, I think is going to carry the day for Seward. It might not be a complete blowout. It might be moderately close, but I think it is going to be a comfortable margin for Seward to win a second term.
Yeah, I don't really have any argument with that. The only thing I'm going to throw in as well is we can't forget, the rump states as well that we have created in this alternate timeline. So we got the Cumberland, we got Franklin, and we still have, of course, West Virginia. And, those basically just exist at this point as nominal representation for disaffected Southern loyalists. And I say Southern loyalists as in loyal to the Union. Yeah. They don't really have much electoral sway or cachet.
No, yeah, just from a pure electoral college perspective, in terms of how many electoral college votes you're talking they have, just on a population basis, maybe combined, maybe 5.
Basically, they're like the Wyomings, North Dakota, South Dakota Republican states that we have in our timeline. They always vote red no matter what, but you just have 3 more votes that you throw into the vote total.
If they get the electoral college equivalent of the gentleman C,
yeah,
they get 3 basically. They get 3 apiece. They have 1 congressperson, 2 senators.
Yeah, that's it.
3. That's it.
Yeah, their emotional support.
Yeah, I think it's basically kind of like.
I'm sorry, I still love the the electoral college equivalent of the gentleman C.
That was actually pretty fire. It's also kind of like in SpongeBob where it's like Patrick is holding up the $3 and he's like, I have $3. That's pretty much.
Yeah, that's basically these states.
These 3 states, yeah.
Yeah, so although they probably go for the Fremont Lincoln ticket, more the unionist rather than strict abolitionist, it's not going to do anything to move the needle. Right. So Seward comfortably cruises to a second term, and then, either right before that or right after he's inaugurated, he's going to, sign the formal peace that ends the Civil War, if it hasn't happened even before Election Day. And so then all the attention is going to turn to, okay, now that the war is over, all of these occupied former states that were once in rebellion, what is the process of bringing them back into the Union, and where do we go from here? So just as a quick refresher for real history, one of Lincoln's controversial things that he did is he did allow I think all but 2 or 3 out of the entire Confederate government and military. He allowed all Confederate veterans to regain citizenship by swearing an oath of loyalty. And that was literally it. You just signed the oath, signed a piece of paper. And unless you were Jeff Davis, the Confederate president, or I think like 2 other people, you were back in. You were a U.S. citizen again, as long as you promised never to take up arms again and swore loyalty to the Constitution. And from a state readmission perspective, he was remarkably more lenient than many, many people in his own party wanted him to be. Lincoln only required 10% of the voting population of any Confederate state to basically sign this loyalty pledge to be able to petition to reobtain statehood. I don't know about you two, but I think under Seward, at the very least, that percentage is going to be higher. And I strongly suspect there's going to be a lot more people in Jeff Davis's little pity boat who don't get to vote.
Well, here's and it's not an episode of A Fork in Time until I quote Stalin.
Until you quote Stalin or bring
What
up
is-
economic theory.
One denial of the right to vote is a tragedy. A million is a statistic.
No, it doesn't matter who votes. It matters who counts.
Matters who counts the votes. Yep.
Yeah.
Basically, the issue here is there were people arguing, oh, well, it should be. I think the number that Dylan suggested was 25%. A quarter of the voting population needs to say, I will no longer commit treason. To this day in the United States, if you are convicted of a felony, you lose your voting rights.
Mhm.
Period. Like, that is ongoing. Treason, which the Confederacy was, you normally get shot for, but if you survive, it sure counts as a felony. And I think what we came to the conclusion of is that kind of interpretation very much fits with what Seward's mindset would have been. It doesn't even matter how many of them sign a pledge. They've already committed a felony for which, I think it was you, Evan, that mentioned in every other Civil War, the losing side gets worse treatment than signing a piece of paper. Maybe they get a paper cut from it. That's the extent of what these Confederates are dealing with. Versus, in the pre-podcast, I said, go ask the Spanish Republicans how well that worked out. Go ask the White Russians how well that works out. Go ask any other side that loses a civil war how well that works out. If you survive, you're lucky. So we'll let you survive, but you lose your voting rights. Is that kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very viable option for sure. And I think that it just kind of giving a preview of coming attractions for ripple effects down the line with the moral effects and the moralistic crusading of this alternate timeline civil war, the more guerrilla nature of resistance kind of towards the end of a shorter civil war as well. I think that Seward has all the ammunition he needs to make the argument that, yep, these guys are not, just as Lincoln would say, errant brethren that need to be brought back into the family, prodigal son, whatever. It's like, nah, these guys are traitors. These guys need to be taught a lesson. We demolished them in the war. And I think a big part of why we have things like the War of Northern Aggression, lost cause sorts of arguments in this time, in our timeline, is because a big part of it is because I would say of Lincoln's softer stance in the initial stages of Reconstruction. And
I'm not going to say Lincoln. I'm going to say Johnson, just because of how it actually happened.
And you're right. That's true as well. But the point I'm trying to get across here is that I don't think there's any room for that. I don't think there's pretty much no losing side in the Civil War that gets to, fly their flag still over state governments, incorporate the battle emblem of that losing side in a lot of their state flags. You realize that a lot of these southern states for a very long time had the Confederate battle emblem in their own flag when they came back to the United States of America.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to go on a tangent here.
No,
for
that's
a minute.
fine.
Forgive
Go
me.
ahead.
There is a town. Actually, it is a county seat in northern central Tennessee. To this day, if you go on Wikipedia, I can't remember which county it is, fortunately, or else people would go do it. If you go look at their flag in 2026, their flag is the bloody banner, the Confederate naval ensign, the stars and bars in the corner, and then the white, and then the red strip on the end. The only change that they did is they put the town logo and the red stripe on the end. Literally, that's it. So this is still very much a thing.
It would not be an American state flag or town flag if it did not have some sort of garish town logo just slapped onto the flag.
Gonna be real honest. I don't want to know what the town emblem is, because that's a dark.
It's actually pretty normal. It's fairly chill.
Okay,
like that was the surprising part.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not like the emblem in
it's like a white bird or something. It's something very mundane and normal.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say it's not gonna be like the emblem in Parks and Recreation.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so we're not gonna have military bases named after losing Confederate generals. We're not gonna have statues of these losing Confederate generals. We're not going to have, streets and all of these things and the Confederate flag still waving. None of that's going to happen. None of that is going to happen in the alternate timeline that we're creating. And I think essentially with the erasure of this, basically just completely removes the basis for any sort of lost cause or reinterpretation of the Civil War to begin with. That in turn leads to a much harsher initial stages of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
So with all of these, basically traitors, felons, not able to vote, we have a lot of newly enfranchised, formerly enslaved African Americans. This makes for a very interesting dynamic in what is now amounting to military occupied territories of the South that were former states, and now they're basically territories. And even though the readmission process is now vastly different, Seward, I think, does realize and know that they're going to have to come back somehow. There's going to be some sort of process for that. So I was almost leading towards my economic theory discussion that I wanted to throw in here, but I think first we should probably talk about, if we don't have a loyalty pledge with voters, then how are these states going to come back?
I actually think so. I think it's going to be in two stages. I actually think there is going to be a loyalty pledge, but there is also going to be an increased voting requirement that goes with it. And the reason I say it's going to come in two stages is because partially because of the demographics of the South. In my neck of the woods, West Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, that is much more dominated by African American, descendants of freed slaves. It's much more black population. South Carolina, yeah, still too very dominated, but other parts of states like Middle Tennessee, parts of Georgia, some of North Carolina, that is much more of a predominantly white area. So while the rules are going to be uniform, I think you're going to see it in a kind of two stages of readmittance. Essentially, you're going to have the more predominantly white parts of states and states where that is more of a, predominantly white population. They're going to come back first because they can meet whatever the voting requirement is from the invalids who couldn't go into the war. There's just going to be more of those guys around that might bump them up to the voting requirement. And the areas that have fewer white people, they won't immediately be able to rejoin because it will take time for newly freed slaves to have the right to vote. And what I mean by that is the victorious government still has to amend the Constitution and abolish slavery, which is going to happen more quickly, but it's going to take probably the better part of a year while they're doing all the other run down the army, clean up everything, rebuild, all of that stuff.
Can I ask an interesting question?
Always.
The United States Constitution has requirements for amendments.
Yes.
And it's based upon, I believe it's 2/3 states approving it.
It's ratification
Plus,
by both chambers of the House and 2/3 of the states. But
is it
the
2/3
House
or 3/4 of the states for amendments?
I want to say it's 2/3. I should know this.
But
Yeah.
Here's my question.
Basically, it's a super majority.
Yeah, here's my question though. If with a Seward presidency, if we have a when you have succession, when they're a foreign country, they don't count towards the 2/3.
Correct.
So it's very possible that what we in the United States think of as the Reconstruction Amendments, abolition of slavery, equal treatment under the law, I think those might actually be pushed through before the war is over, so that they're standing law before we're even looking at readmission of any states.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't even think
That's
about that.
really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right.
And by the way,
Or at least it'll be finishing up.
Yeah, just as a quick fact check, 2/3 of states or 2/3 of both houses of Congress is how you call a convention to propose amendments.
Yeah.
But actual ratification is 3/4 of states.
Yeah.
But
So we were technically both right.
yeah, but if you have fewer states,
Right.
Yeah.
that gets a lot easier.
Yeah. And the 3/4 of states ratification is the part that I was imagining taking more time, because that part is dependent on each individual governor of each individual state getting around to signing the stupid thing.
Mhm.
You know, it's
And
kind of like the
perfectly
Declaration of Independence wasn't actually signed on July 4th. It was signed over a period of 2 months because not all of those guys were stupid enough to be in town on the same day.
But the point being, in our timeline, southern states were kind of told, hey, ratify these amendments and we'll let you back in, like formally. And you know, we can talk about that being coercive. At this point, they're not in the US. And it's so that's not even an issue when it comes to Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. But so, and that brings up an interesting point. So, you know, I agree. I'll retract my earlier idea about how long it'll take. I do think it will come relatively quickly. But to your point, Chris, that leaves a lot of voting age Southern former Confederates in kind of the lurch, because they can't stick around in their current states and still vote.
Listen, they can stick around in their former states,
but they can't vote.
They just can't vote.
They can't vote.
And so obviously some of them are going to stick around, but some of them, either because of the inability to affect the political process that they now can't stand, but also can't change. And some of them, you know, it's like in our timeline where they're going to come home and the family farm's been destroyed and, you know, all this other stuff. They just are going to need.
And frankly, in this case, we're going to have a lot of them calling on local law enforcement who are elected by their former slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not going to be a comfortable.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting at. So there's going to be multiple reasons, but a lot of these guys are going to not want to stick around where they were before the war. So what are their options in terms of where to go? And I think in the second episode, just to kind of set this up, because everybody all knows where I'm leading to. In the second episode, we talked about how the war was much more than in our timeline east of the Mississippi. The West was it was just doing its thing, but all the fighting was primarily on the Atlantic seaboard and the near Mississippi, like Kentucky, Tennessee, into Mississippi and Alabama.
Imagine a peninsula between those two, the Atlantic and the Mississippi.
Yeah. So the West is still, I mean, just from a geographic perspective, it's still wide open territory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, because it was much less the focus of the fighting, there is a lot more ability for the Confederates that are both out there, especially in the territories, to say, you know, we've still got some fight in us. You know, we're still here. There's ain't no laws out here. We can kind of do what we want. So, you know, I don't know about y'all, but I envision westward expansion, at least into kind of the territories, is going to be a much more popular alternative for some of these guys, especially the ones who don't necessarily want to acknowledge they've lost the fight, or, you know, like in any war, some guys, once they start fighting, they just don't want to stop.
I mean, we've talked about Joe Wheeler, I think, before.
Yeah.
In this idea of, well, I can't fight the Yankees anymore, but I still want to fight somebody.
Yeah.
I
can't punch the guy I want to, so I'm going to punch this guy instead.
Yeah. His blood's up.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think what we talked about was it's really interesting in a lot of like American cowboy movies, there is a little bit of like former Confederates who learn how to handle guns coming out.
Mm-hmm.
I think that becomes a lot more, and I think that also becomes really important in maybe they're not going to put on the Union blue. I don't think I think that might be a bridge too far for them.
Yeah. But you think they're going to go work for like the state or territorial militia maybe or something?
or even like bands that go
Yeah.
out.
Oh, yeah. Almost
I can see that.
almost like the cowboys from those of you who love Tombstone as much as I do, the red banded cowboys, but more of a not officially state sanctioned, but not state unsanctioned.
Not
They're kind of in the
disapproved,
in the gray area
yeah.
where they don't work for the state, but the state's not working against them.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and
And the
bring
state's
another-
more than happy to give them dirty work or allow them to take care of dirty work that they don't want to.
because this
Yes.
is me. Let's make another Russian reference. The Little Green Men.
Yes. Yeah. The little gray men.
Yes, the little ooh,
Oh,
episode title.
possibly.
Ooh.
They're going to be unleashed on the West, and specifically the Native Americans in the West who are still resisting federal power.
Yeah.
hmm
And I think that's going to make really interesting kind of distinction between what we understand as westward expansion in our timeline versus this timeline. Is, in our timeline, there was some southern westward expansion at first, obviously in the New Mexico and the Indian territories and stuff, but a lot of the more famous Indian battles of, kind of the Wild West in the 1860s and 70s and into the 80s, they're all up north. Like the Little Bighorn is in South Dakota,
Yep.
and Montana and all these places. I don't know if you've ever met a whole lot of Southern people in your life, but most of us do not like cold weather. We are used to heat. We prefer to stay that way. So one of the interesting things is that I think the Southwest is going to become, not rapidly, but kind of as a natural consequence, the earlier, more settled area, or it's going to increase in population more than, say, your South Dakotas, your North Dakotas, your Montanas, because that's just where all these guys are going. And once they get there, the Indian problem is going to be reduced because, the Confederates are going to go after the Native American tribes that are out there. But also with more people comes quicker discoveries of the things that attracted people out there in our timeline, like Tombstone, Arizona famously only existed because of a silver mine. Well, while these guys are in the woods and in the desert, they're going to stumble across this stuff. So it's going to get back quicker.
Yeah, I mean, and hey, Dylan, you have a good point. It's a dry heat. They're coming from a place that's a humid heat. It's a dry heat.
Yeah.
They like moving out there faster. I think this also has a very interesting implication for, this is where I'm going to throw in the economic theory side of things here. But in the post-Civil War South in our timeline, we have a phenomenon known as sharecropping, which is basically, these newly freed African American former slaves. It's basically what I like to call it is just slavery with extra steps. It's like the people who were there, the former antebellum South slave owners, they can't formally own these people anymore, but they can definitely, jack up rents on equipment and, buy their land, buy African Americans' land interests, and basically just pay them poverty wages. So it's not technically slavery, guys, but in all actuality and practice, it's just mainly a continuation of a lot of the economic realities that existed before the Civil War.
Yeah, essentially what it is it's the closest America has ever come to serfdom.
Yeah,
in the
much.
Russian sense.
Yes, exactly. Another Russia reference for you guys. And so I think with what we're developing here, with a lot more of these, first of all, these Southerners not really having political power or cachet, not having probably even less economic power now. And also something that I noted in the pre-podcast is Andrew Johnson was largely the one responsible for rescinding some measures that were put in place this is where we get the phrase 40 acres and a mule. It actually came from an order from Sherman, I believe, basically wanting to help these newly enfranchised African Americans get a leg up and not just be like, okay, you got your political freedom. Great. Now you got nothing to show for it. And you just got to fight your way in a very hostile environment in a post-war, just post-war area. So I think with a more radical Republican, moralistic crusader sort of presidency, we're going to have more of an emphasis and focus on, and probably no rescinding of those sorts of acts. How, to what extent those acts are actually going to be enforceable, it's probably up for debate. But be that as it may, what I see as, a lot of the losers of the war are just going to be heading west for the most part, or a lot of them are. Less political power, less economic power. I think there will be a lot of instances of African Americans, they don't have the skill sets needed necessarily to run a business or to run their own farm, but so they might have to be forced to sell their land still or things like that. But Chris, you presented a really good point that a decent number of these former slaves probably did have a pretty good sense of business acumen, were accountants, were running, to a certain extent, the day-to-day operations of a lot of their former slave owners' businesses. They're probably going to have pretty successful enterprises and operations once they have their own 40 acres and a mule. So I think there's two factors that I think could actually lead to, I'm not going to say like Martin Luther King Jr., like racial nirvana, in the 1860s and 70s. But I think there are some factors that might lead to softening of tensions in certain ways going on here. For starters, you have most of the KKK types and the very radical, whites just shipping themselves off west. So there's less of them to really terrorize the newly freed and enfranchised African Americans to begin with. But secondly, you have a lot of these African Americans on a stronger economic footing. Let's be generous and say like a third of them hold on to their land and become pretty successful landowners. Well, it becomes a lot harder to argue that blacks are, have to have a paternalistic, race looking over them. White people, they're incapable of running their own businesses. They're incapable of all of these things. We have to have them enslaved because if we don't, we're going to have John Brown sorts of riots and them run things into the ground. That's way harder to argue that if you see a former slave down the road doing amazing with his business, whether that's a tobacco farm, whether that's, cotton, whether that's just any kind of farm or agriculture industry. It becomes a lot harder to argue that an entire race that just got freed is inferior if they're doing a really good job with the freedom that they've been given, however limited it might be. So I think in terms of economics, there's going to be, in this alternate timeline, a possibly much smoother and more successful outcomes, I would say, for African Americans than we see in our timeline's reconstruction. Because, there's going to be less people to fight back against them.
Well, I think what you mentioned, what we kind of threw out earlier, it's not just economics here. It's the politics. It's the local sheriff. It's the county council. It's all of these things that are now right after there's this amazing, right after the Civil War in our timeline, there's an amazing explosion of talent coming out. And so much of that gets shoved back down onto the field because of the end of Reconstruction, because the white power structure in the South comes back in and captures the political power. Once they have the political power, then they can translate that into the economic power. When in our situation, in our timeline, if African Americans actually saved up and bought land, guess what? The Register of Deeds in the county keeps the fact that they own that. If they're not honest, or if they're against this African American landowner, that doesn't happen. In this timeline, you have political power captured by African Americans. And I think what we talked about off podcast is that you're still going to have a concentration of power. It's just not going to mask onto a racial division the same way it does in our timeline.
Yeah, I 100% agree. All right.
All right.
Well, I
But-
think we covered a lot of ground pretty quickly here. If
I
there's
have
nothing
a
else,
fun little thing I have to throw out, which I
Yeah.
think is really kind of cool. Most any American who hears about William Seward probably associates him with Seward's Folly and the purchase of Alaska.
Mhm.
Do you want to know why Russia sold us Alaska? Because they needed liquidity. Because when they liberated their serfs, they compensated the landowners for them. That's why they needed the money to sell us Alaska. So I think that's a really interesting closing point to this.
Yeah.
And actually, when you mentioned that, Chris, it actually reminded me of something that I don't think we mentioned, and I want to mention because we talked about it in the pre-podcast quite a bit, and that is Abraham Lincoln got assassinated in our timeline. Does William Seward get assassinated, or at least an attempt, in this alternate timeline? And for sake of brevity, sorry, Chris, you wanted to throw in something?
Yeah. Also, there was an assassination attempt on William Seward the night Lincoln died.
Yeah, that was part of the assassination attempt.
Right, exactly. But as I said in the pre-podcast, I think that with the tone and tenor of the war being a lot different heading into the 1864 election, and when you look at John Wilkes Booth's motivations for trying to not just kill Lincoln, but also Vice President Johnson and William Seward, he was hoping to revive the Confederate cause. If the Confederate cause is basically already almost lost, there's not going to be that strong of a motivation. Now, I think there's still going to be people who are very upset, especially given Seward's, being about as huggable as an angry porcupine political personality and disposition towards the South. So I think there is actually going to be an assassination attempt on Seward, but Seward is a bad boy. And he was able to live a vicious stabbing in our timeline. I think he survives and is able to serve out the rest of his term in this alternate timeline. So for those of us or the audience who may have been wondering about that, I just wanted to throw that in here, that potentiality in here pretty quickly. We do not end up with a dead Seward, and we still end up with the Alaskan icebox, I would say, somewhere along the way. Before we finish out here, gentlemen, I did, for the more pop culture sensitive segments of our audience, Helena Nash, I did want to throw in some things that I think I would be remiss to not mention, at least name drop, some cultural things that would not exist with the Lincoln Lost timeline. We might not have Lincoln logs as a toy. Right? It might be named after some other Westerner. There might be Fremont logs. Who knows?
Seward sawboards.
Yeah, or Seward sawboards. I wasn't going to say Seward because, Seward was not from that area, or in that kind of a housing arrangement. So it would probably be some other politician or famous rich person that they're named after if they get to be made into a thing. We're not going to have Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. That's not going to be.
Thank God.
Mount Rushmore.
Let me just say this, though. Given that you did just say that Seward was as cuddly as a porcupine, I could see him coming back as an action hero. Like, that movie might need to happen.
Okay, but maybe not as a vampire slayer, but I don't know. As some sort of action movie hero, I could see that coming down the pike somehow. Mount Rushmore. We don't have Lincoln on Mount Rushmore. Is Seward going to be as seen as transformational and impactful of a president as Lincoln? I don't know if we can make the argument that it'll just be a face swap between Lincoln and Seward. I don't know. I mean, perhaps.
I think he's even more transformational than Lincoln because he, again, if there's a legitimate transfer of political power in the American South, that is something Lincoln did not accomplish.
That is something Lincoln did not accomplish.
Maybe it may not be, maybe it's not perceived as big because they don't understand how bad things could have gone.
Right.
A lighter reconstruction, but completely reforming the structure of half of the country.
I mean, he's still going to be the guy in charge of the most consequential, war between American brethren, the Civil War. So, like, yeah, maybe there is a very strong argument to be made that Seward ends up being on Mount Rushmore instead. Maybe we have him on the $5 bill too, because Lincoln's not going to be on the $5 bill anymore. We have one of the most famous American poets, Walt Whitman. He wrote a lot of poems, either directly or indirectly referring to Abraham Lincoln. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Well, that only happened because Lincoln got shot and killed. So we're not going to have, I would argue, a lot of these, important poems and songs. Abraham Lincoln is referenced in 1,000 songs, I believe. So Seward might appear in 300 songs, 400 songs. I don't know. I just think there is a sort of ethos and credibility and mythos around Lincoln. And a big reason of that is because he got shot and killed very early on in his administration. I think if we have a William Seward, as you mentioned, Chris, who serves out both of his terms, but we, in the alternate timeline, wouldn't know how bad things could have gotten, the appreciation factor might not be quite as strong. I think he would still be looked on very favorably in historian presidential rankings, but I think a big reason why Lincoln is remembered as strongly as he is because, it's kind of why JFK, is memorialized as much as he is because he died in office.
Yeah, sure than anything he actually did.
Yeah. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Like they make a few references to Lincoln. The Birth of a Nation, which is, and I happen to throw in our favorite Woodrow Wilson here in this episode as well. I managed to figure out a way to do that. I, of course, have never seen that movie. I don't plan on seeing it, but the assassination of Lincoln was the central event of that movie, which I actually did not personally know. And so, no Lincoln? I'm not going to say there's not going to be a Birth of a Nation, but there might actually be a strong possibility that we don't, because, again, the lost cause and all that kind of stuff and the strength of the KKK and those kind of things very much diluted in the alternate timeline. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention some of our favorite video games and simulation, sort of games. In Civilization 6, I believe it's Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln as like the two presidents that you can choose from. If we don't have Lincoln, maybe it's just Teddy. Maybe, who knows?
Well, Roosevelt cousins.
Yeah, there you go. Quite possibly. Lincoln has a ton of statues all over the place too. You have statues of him in Mexico, statues of him in Cuba. Again, I don't know if it's just going to be less of that. Seward is still going to be kind of all over the place, but maybe just of a lesser impact. But I think all of these things I'm rattling off here as we bring this episode to a close illustrate the point that Lincoln, I would say, would be perceived much more positively and is perceived much more positively because he was assassinated and because he had this, more gentle, conciliatory sort of plan for the South. Seward, not having that, nice of a personality and disposition, a much harsher reaction, probably, and because we don't know in the alternate timeline how bad things might have gotten if things went a different way. I think he's not going to be as culturally significant, but I think politically he's going to have a much more seismic impact on American, governance moving forward after his presidency. I think there's going to be Lincoln consolidated a lot of power in the presidency with his approach. I think there's going to be an even stronger head of the federal government, presidential approach moving forward after the Seward presidency. But anyway, those are just some of my parting thoughts, my little ending soliloquy on cultural impacts and political impacts. Anything else that you gentlemen would like to mention before we wrap up this arc?
I kind of want to throw it out. We kind of hinted at westward expansion, what's going on out there, at Alaska, at some other things going on. I always love to do more episodes. I always love to go deeper, go further. On Discord, let us know. I think that's a really interesting opportunity for us to kind of plug that and say, hey, like, do you want more of this one?
Yeah, because I did say we're bringing this arc to a close, but there does exist the distinct possibility that we could expand westward into a fourth part to talk about the implications of a different westward expansion moving forward after the Civil War. But I think functionally for now, unless we have like huge demand on Discord, this is probably where we're going to end things. But I think, Chris, that's a great idea. Throw it out to our audience, see what they if they want us to keep moving forward down this road. Dylan, you got anything else that you want to throw out there?
No, I think we're about it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. And as like we just plugged, check us out on Discord. We have a nice, small, but vibrant little community there. It's a great way to interact with us and give us more show ideas and topics. And just tell us what we got wrong or what we got right, or you can even continue the timeline yourself if you want. But as we always like to end things off here on the show, if we happen to stumble across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with that?
Ground the lost cause under your heel, right at the crossroads.
After you stab it with said fork. I think that sounds like a great idea. But what we traditionally say is if we stumble across a fork in time, you should take it. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.